But now start with the topic for today, nitrogen and sulfur nutrition. As it has been mentioned, my program is split in two parts. The first part, I will talk about the kind of general role of nitrogen in crops and sulfur in crops, and look at the sulfur uptake quantities and the removal of key crops. After the first break and Q&A session, I will continue with the nitrogen management in these particular crops like winter wheat, sugar beet, maize, sunflower, and soybean. Those crops Astarta has mainly in their crop rotations. I like to start with a kind of refresher and highlight a bit what happens with nitrogen in soil. You are probably very familiar with, but as a kind of background, it's very useful to have a brief look at the nitrogen metabolism in soil. In soil, more than 90% of the nitrogen is an organic matter, and the crop takes up the nitrogen in the form of nitrate, ammonium, and it can take up also some urea. So the nitrate and ammonium comes from the release of nitrogen from the soil organic matter. And if this release rate is not sufficient to supply the crop with nitrogen, we need to apply nitrogen by either mineral fertilizer in the form of ammonium nitrate or compound NPK or urea. And what's missing here, of course, also the additional nitrogen can be applied by organic manure, slurry, and so forth, or composts. The nitrogen release from the organic matter is very difficult to predict because it depends very much on weather conditions, soil moisture and temperature in particular. And all the measures to improve the accuracy of nitrogen application deals very much with controlling this pool or have a good estimate what is the release of this organic matter pool is, because the difference between what released from the organic matter and what the crop has to be taken up to build a certain yield has to come from fertilizer. It's very important that we get the right rate of fertilizer because if we have an over application, the losses of nitrogen either as gas, ammonia gas, N2O and so forth, or the leaching as nitrate is a loss for the grower because he cannot make use of this nitrogen, which is quite often expensive farm input. But also it affects the environment and needs to be reduced as much as possible. But yeah, the purpose of nitrogen nutrition is very much to get the right amount of nitrogen into the crop. The role of nitrogen is that it performs as a building block of amino acids and the DNA in the crop. And amino acids form proteins, and further on the proteins into enzymes. And these enzymes, as you all know, control all the metabolism in a crop. But the second role is, of course, to store proteins in seeds. And this affects very much the harvest quality, for instance, in wheat, the baking quality of the wheat flour. Amongst the nutrients, we know that nitrogen is needed in the largest quantities, similar to potassium in some crops. And in general, it's the most yield-limiting plant nutrient, and therefore it's most important, right, to get the rate of nitrogen right, because if it's too short, we lose yield. If it's too much, we have a threat to the environment. and also the crop doesn't perform in the best manner. So it's a major driver of plant vigor and yield. And in all our efforts to derive the nitrogen rate, it's most important to get the rate close to the economic optimum, because as the optimum said, this gives us the best performance of the crop, but also the highest economic return for what we are doing in the field. But of course, this applies only under conditions where all other nutrients are at adequate supply. We have to bear in mind if something is essential nutrient is missing or is very short, then of course also our nitrogen cannot do a proper job. As I said, it's very important to avoid any excess of nitrogen because excess of nitrogen in a way causes an overexpression of vegetative growth, which we don't like for crops where we mainly harvest in a way the grains and seeds. It can delay maturity. As we know, if we have an excess, the crop builds some soft tissue, and soft tissue with thin cell walls, very high loaded vacuoles are more susceptible to diseases like rust and mildew, for instance, or also to lodging. As we know, low nitrogen use efficiency is a result of excess of nitrogen because the crop has only a limited capability to use the nitrogen, and low water use efficiency is also another consequence. And as I mentioned, nitrate leaching, eutrophication are environmental impacts we like to avoid. And recently we have a lot of discussions about carbon dioxide emissions because they contribute to global warming. And of course, we know that nitrogen fertilizer production is very energy intensive. So by getting the nitrogen rate right, we can save some of these CO2 emissions. And in the field, we have nitrous oxide emissions and N2O, which also contribute to global warming. And these emissions depend also very much on the quantity of nitrogen applied. Nitrogen is not nitrogen, so the different forms have a different physiological effect, as it's shown by this picture, which derives from trial in a nutrient solution. So the soil, there was no soil, and this means really the nitrogen form has been supplied to the crop as indicated. And we can see that if we have only nitrate, and when the crop grows with many, many tillers, broad leaves, if we have only ammonium, you see that the crop doesn't tiller so much, and also root growth is less. A mixture of ammonium and nitrate, as you can see, very similar to nitrate nutrition. And then also, and that's not known by everyone, urea can be taken up, but normally only in very small quantities. But this is just to illustrate that the different forms has the crop responds different to different forms supplied to the crop. But we have to bear in mind that in soil, these effects are only short term because the different forms are converted into mainly into nitrate. Because if we apply urea, urea is hydrolyzed to ammonium within days at soil temperatures higher than 4 centigrades. And also ammonium now is nitrified in the soil at temperatures higher than 8, and it doesn't last very long in the growing season in the soil, because it becomes nitrate very soon. This effect of nitrogen form can last longer if soil temperatures are quite low, lower than indicated, and fertilizer, or if fertilizers are placed in bands, so having being very concentrated, and of course when urease and nitrification inhibitors are used to stabilize the urea and ammonium form. I mention this because when it comes to fertilizer application, in particular early in the season, when the crop tillers, or when we need to control the plant density, these effects under low temperatures can matter, and we will come to that later. You are very much aware of the different nitrogen forms in fertilizer. As it's shown in this table, it's more for reference that different products have a different ratio of nitrate to ammonium or urea. And some fertilizer come with some additional nutrients. And yeah, I like to highlight only the sulfur containing nitrogen fertilizers like ammonium sulfate nitrate or ammonium sulfate, very much used as a sulfur source in agriculture these days because of the increase in sulfur demand all over Europe and also globally. But we will talk about sulfur later. As I have mentioned, the nitrogen supply at tillering is very much, and we talk about cereals here, affects very much the number of productive tillers, and is a measure really to get it right early in the season. Because the kind of very short message is, if there is an excess of tillers, the crop will spoil water, so it cannot make good use of the available water. And of course, if there is a scarcity of tillers, the crop doesn't get to the yield objective, which is potential possible. So water use efficiency is typically higher with a low number, but heavier ears, and with a yield objective of 7.5 tons on average. I'm pretty sure that 400 to 500 productivity tillers are sufficient to get to this yield objective, which means at planting we shouldn't have more plants established than 200 to 250 per square meter. The nitrogen form and timing are additional factors which can influence the tiller density. And the graph shows you the response of in tiller density to different nitrogen rates and different nitrogen forms. So it's quite obvious that with increasing nitrogen rate, you can boost the number of tillers, and it looks like that this applies very much to the ammonium nitrate or to the nitrate form, whereas the ammonium form, it doesn't have the same kind of effect. It has an effect, but the number of tillers with ammonium nutrition is less compared to ammonium nitrate nutrition and urea. So this shows that with the form and rate, we can impact the tiller density in cereals quite nicely early in the season if the crop stand is right. And the purpose of having a good tiller density, or the optimum tiller density, is to make best use of water, because if it's too much, then the crop consumes a lot of water for unproductive tillers, and there's not really sufficient to support, let's say, the highest yielding tillers. And water use efficiency in general, and this is shown in these two graphs, can be or is increased with nitrogen supply. So with increasing nitrogen supply, of course, we know we increase yield, but we also increase water use efficiency to a point where nitrogen rate is optimum. So if we exceed this optimum rate, which is basically the maximum, the agronomy optimum, the maximum yield achievable, then we waste water, which cannot be used for consumption. And this is also the same kind of trial where it shows in a way how the crop responds to the different nitrogen rates. And you can see that in a way, this level of 2.4 in the pot trial was optimum. If you exceed this rate, you get a lot of unproductive tillers and a lot of very broad leaves consuming water, which needs to be avoided. Just in brief, there's also another effect of ammonium and nitrate nutrition. When most of the nitrogen is supplied to the crop as ammonium, we know that as a counter transport to the ammonium uptake, the crop releases some acidic components, H+ protons basically. And this means the pH in the vicinity of the roots decrease. And this decrease in pH can have quite often a nice effect on the availability of some nutrients. In particular, for this kind of effect, we can see a better supply of phosphorus, manganese, and zinc. With the nitrate form is the opposite. So we have a pH increase in the vicinity of the roots, but there's no really very strong effect on availability of nutrients. So of course, those which increase with a pH decrease can be expected to be of shorter supply if the pH increases in the rhizosphere. So after this kind of recap on nitrogen, I like to continue with the role of sulfur. The role of sulfur in plants is a kind of dual role. It has a metabolic role like nitrogen, and it has also a role in on specific crop components. Sulfur is taken up as sulfate only, and this sulfate is in the soil as mobile as nitrate. So in a way, we cannot, like nitrogen, we cannot store too much sulfate in the soil, because if there's an excess of water, it is at a risk to be lost via leaching. So after the uptake of sulfate into the crop, it follows similar pathways like the nitrogen, which means it is incorporated into amino acids. You know, we have a couple of sulfur-containing amino acids, such like cysteine, methionine, lysine is another one. And when they are in this amino acids, the amino acids, as you know, form long chains of, let's say, protein molecules. And the sulfur molecule in the amino acids makes this protein folding into a secondary and quaternary structure, which finally builds the enzyme. So sulfur is very important as a part of a lot of enzymes, and therefore facilitating many plant metabolism, like chlorophyll production, carbohydrate production and storage, and also very important, the nitrogen assimilation. So if there is a lack of sulfur. The nitrogen taken up, and in particular nitrate nitrogen, cannot be metabolized, and therefore, and we will come to that in a minute, sulfur deficiencies quite often look like nitrogen deficiencies, because in a way the nitrogen is not active in the crop. The second role, as I said, sulfur is an essential part of plant compounds. We know about mustard oils, glucosinolates in brassicas, not so much wanted in oilseed rape, but wanted, of course, in cabbages and so on, because it determines the taste of these kind of produces. Alanine in onions, and of course, we have storage proteins in wheat. And the concentration of these compounds can be increased by nitrogen and sulfur application. So that means sulfur has an impact on the harvest quality. It influences the pungency, for instance, of onions, meaning the taste. It is part of proteins in wheat, and therefore it affects the baking quality of wheat flour. These compounds quite often are in the crop to defend the crop against pests in particular, but also some diseases. But sometimes in a way unwanted, because if the byproduct, for instance, the oilseed rape pulp is used as animal feed, in a way high concentrations of this compound reduce the acceptability of this feed. Just to highlight a bit how sulfur deficiency symptoms look like. I don't know to what extent you have seen them in Ukraine. So sulfur deficiency quite often is observed to become more severe if we have excess of very high nitrogen application rate, and meaning high nitrogen content in the crop. So it's not only the absolute quantity of nitrogen and sulfur in the crop, also the nitrogen to sulfur ratio in the crop is very important, and it's important to get it right. Other than nitrogen, even the symptoms look somehow same. The symptoms of sulfur deficiency occur in the youngest leaves first, because sulfur is less mobile in the crop. And as a kind of illustration, you see here the wheat crop, fully nourished with both nitrogen and sulfur. A nitrogen deficiency normally occurs at the older leaves. You see the yellowing, kind of chlorosis very much on the bottom. Whereas in a way, if nitrogen is okay and sulfur is lacking, you see in a way yellowing leaves, or lighter green leaves on the top. We know that oilseed rape is most demanding sulfur crop amongst those crops we have in our geography. In oilseed crop, of course, leaf symptoms look somehow similar and more special. It's quite often we have some reddish leaves as an indication of sulfur. But the whitish flower is one very specific one. So if sulfur is missing, then the flowering is of course limited, but the flower, the petioles are of course much lighter yellow. As I said, the nitrogen and sulfur cycle in soil are very similar. Also, sulfur, most of the sulfur is in this organic fraction. Again, 90 to 95% of the total sulfur in the soil is organic, and only the sulfate sulfur can be used by the crop. So it depends very much, how much sulfur can be released from this pool to derive the required amount of sulfur, which needs to be applied by fertilizer. And somehow sulfur is a kind of not new, but let's say a nutrient which came on to the agenda in the mid 90s, late 90s. And the reason why was that before, all the sulfur required by the crops derived from sulfur deposition from what we call the acid rains. And this was more a problem because we had problems in forests and other biotopes of, let's say, acidification. And because of that, all the power plants and all the energy consuming or fuel, fossil energy consuming production has been upgraded with SO2 abatement technology. And because of the implementation of this abatement technology, the sulfur deposition, which has peaked in the 80s, as you can see here from two sites close to Ukraine or even in Ukraine, has peaked in this area at a rate of 35 to 40 or even 40 to 50 kilograms sulfur, sulfate sulfur per hectare. And because of the installment of all this abatement technology, nowadays the deposition of sulfur by rains and dry deposition is less than 10 kilograms. And because of that, less than 10 kilograms is not anymore sufficient to supply the crop. And therefore, from mid-90s up to now, the consumption of sulfur as a fertilizer has increased steadily and very significantly. So as I said, sulfur in soil, most in the organic part. The breakdown of sulfate is made by soil organism, so it depends very much on soil temperatures and moisture. It's mobile in the soil and therefore it cannot be stored, so it's leached if there's an excess of sulfur. And in order to check whether there is a sulfur need, initially the analysis of sulfate sulfur in soil has been investigated, and some threshold figures were derived based on this research. So sulfur can be analyzed in soil samples, and because sulfur is taken up as nitrogen from deeper layers also and is available in lower layers, they recommended sampling of 0 to 60 centimeters. And for demanding crops like, for instance, oilseed rape, the threshold was to have more than 60 kilograms sulfur. And at this level, there wouldn't be any kind of yield response to sulfur. Of course, less demanding crops they could do with 30 kilograms in the 0 to 60 centimeter layers. And if this amount of sulfur is available early in the season, then we would expect a crop yield response of this lower demanding crops like cereals, corn, sunflower, and sugar beets. But this kind of soil analysis in a way was not really widespread because in many Western European countries it became obvious that oilseed rape has to receive sulfur, and also then followed very much by wheat, where growers saw some sulfur deficiencies. And as we will talk later about it, they also, sulfur has an important impact on the quantity of protein in the grain. And it has been observed that a shortage of sulfur reduces protein in grain and also protein quality in wheat flour. But as you can see, sulfur, from what I have talked about, sulfur behaves very similar to nitrogen in soil. And therefore, quite often, and probably the best way to apply sulfur is together with nitrogen. And that's the reason why a lot of nitrogen plus sulfur fertilizers have been developed and are available to growers these days. When we talk fertilizers, we also can consider organic fertilizers as sulfur sources. But with organic sources, as I said, the release of sulfate sulfur depends very much on temperature. And even so, the soil is loaded with heavy amounts of whatever compost for 8 years at 15 tons or slurry for 20 years. This organic sulfur is released as sulfate sulfur normally too late in the season, because we need the sulfur already in whatever March, April, and you can see that the release of this sulfur from organic matter is quite limited early. Later on, of course, as soon as the soil is warm, we get better release of sulfur from the organic fertilizers, or also from the organic matter in soil. Just as an illustration, this pot trials where sulfur has been applied either 30 kilograms or 60 kilograms, in this case in the form of potassium sulfate, or in comparison to that, as slurry, farmyard manure, or compost. So again, 60 kilograms of sulfur. And you can see that even so the amount of sulfur was quite significant, the response to this organic sulfur was somehow limited, not comparable to the sulfur which came as sulfate to the soil. And the most important reason is that in these kind of organic fertilizers, the ratio between carbon and sulfur is very high. And that means, in a way, the microbes who facilitate the release of sulfate, in a way, are not too much interested in assessing this sulfur, because the carbon to sulfur ratio is too high. This also determines very much, in a way, the strategy of sulfur application. And here we have an illustration about the sulfur fertilizer demand of an oilseed rape crop and a wheat crop. The oilseed rape crop in blue. We have, of course, the oilseed rape and wheat are planted in fall the previous year. Normally, the sulfur need is limited in before winter. Then we have the dormancy period, and then we have a very steep increase of sulfur demand for both crops. Oilseed rape even earlier than the wheat crop, as you probably know. And when we look at what the soil can deliver, with the grayish part of this graph illustrating the mineralization. So of course, quite often in autumn, we have still sufficient sulfur coming from mineralization. There's a debate whether sulfur is needed for oilseed rape in autumn already, but there's not a lot of evidence that this is the case. For wheat, normally not. But as soon as the uptake starts, the intensive uptake starts in spring, we have a gap between what the soil can deliver and what the crop needs. And this gap, of course, is bigger for a demanding crop like oilseed rape compared to wheat crop. But in any case, the assumption is that for oilseed rape, 2/3 of the sulfur required to build the crop has to come from fertilizers. 1/3 can be from soil. And for wheat crop, the soil can deliver 50% of the sulfur, but some additional sulfur is needed as a fertilizer to fill this gap. So, in a way, we know now about, in a way, the role of sulfur and how sulfur is taken up, and also nitrogen is taken up. So, in the next couple of minutes, I like to go through the uptake and removal figures and the critical leaf levels for these two nutrients in key crops. So, when starting in a way a fertilizer plan, normally we should start with calculation how much nitrogen, in this case sulfur, is involved in producing a certain yield, and what we do in the field in a way should be sufficient that there's the supply of the nutrients cover what the crop takes up to build a yield which we aim for. So when we look at oilseed rape, wheat, corn, sunflower, sugar beet, and soybean, and we don't go to all of these figures. It's also more for reference. But what they need to build a ton of yield is indicated as a nitrogen and sulfur uptake figure here. So for instance, oilseed rape as a very sulfur demanding crop would need about 10 kilograms of sulfur per ton of yield and 50 kilograms of nitrogen per ton of yield. Sugar beet, you see, in a way, it's supposed to be very low, but of course, you know that in a way, a ton of sugar beet, in a way, is fresh matter, and therefore, in a way, we have these lower numbers. I have mentioned that, in a way, soil analysis can be done to derive the sulfur need, but let's say more in use and probably also more efficient would be an analysis of the leaf contents of both nitrogen and sulfur. And this gives you an indication of what would be the critical level of sulfur you should have in the leaves or in a tissue sample, so to say, to make sure that the crop doesn't suffer from sulfur deficiency. And it's, as I said, it's not only the sulfur as such, also the nitrogen to sulfur ratio is important, and demanding crops have, of course, smaller nitrogen to sulfur ratio compared to the wheat and to the other crops. In wheat, corn is typically a 10 nitrogen to sulfur ratio, whereas sunflower, sugar beet, and soybean is a bit higher, towards 15. Just focusing a bit on sulfur uptake and removal of the crops, and a calculation what a 4 tons oilseed rape crop, 8 tons wheat crop, 10 tons maize crop, 2 tons sunflower, 50 tons sugar beet, and 3 tons soybean crop would require to build this yield. Again, very demanding, oilseed rape 50. Next to that is would be wheat and maize. So if sulfur supply from soil is critical, we observe it, of course, first in crops like oilseed rape. Wheat will follow first with probably with a reduction in protein content, and second with a yield response. Maize, we will see a yield response if we don't have adequate sulfur supply, and then other crops would probably follow. Also, soybean is a kind of demanding crop, and we will talk about that later. The removal with the grain or the beet is of course only part of it, and then of course, the residues, for instance, oilseed rape, have quite, it can quite deliver some sulfur to the next crop. It should be also considered. So, for instance, after oilseed rape, the response to sulfur is probably very limited for the following crop, whereas, of course, my sunflower takes not too much sulfur, but also doesn't leave too much sulfur in the soil. So after sunflower, we would expect it for a demanding crop, maybe a good response to sulfur fertilizer. And again, for reference, and this is just an illustration for the where the nitrogen uptake figures come from, I will refer to in the second part of my presentation. The nitrogen uptake and removal figures for wheat, sugar beet, maize, and sunflower and soybean. So we know sunflower, soybean as protein, high protein crops per ton of harvested yield have much higher nitrogen uptake and removal. Maize and wheat somehow similar. Sugar beet again is fresh matter. And then, of course, the difference between the uptake and removal is what left in the field. We know that after wheat, there's maybe a very limited amount of nitrogen available for the following crop. Maize is somehow a bit higher, but of course we know that, for instance, after soybean, also because of nitrogen fixation and so on, we have quite a lot of nitrogen residues, which needs to be accounted, taken into account for the following crop.